A new Assassin's Creed game has been released, so to celebrate a new installment in this history-spanning series, it is right and just that we figure out just how historical it actually is. Previously, we've dug into the realism of Assassin's Creed Origins and Odyssey to see how their Ptolemaic Egypt and classical Greek settings hold up, and today we're off north to sail with the Vikings in AC Valhalla. In many ways, this game follows the same principles of historical accuracy that have guided the series so far, but in a few specific but notable places, they take a different approach. Overall, I think I can describe the history presented in Valhalla as generally decent, except for the parts that are wildly sensationalized, which throw the whole thing into question. And to see what that looks like in practice, let's do some history. If you're familiar with the history of the Viking Age, you'll know that it covered 3 whole centuries and almost the entirety of Northern Europe, so there were a lot of places a Viking game could go. And while I have some personal opinions on when and where would make the most interesting setting in Viking history, none of that matters because the game takes place in England in 873 AD, so that's what we get. That sets us smack in the middle of the Great Viking Army, a loosely assembled force of Danes and Norwegians that fought the Saxon kingdoms to carve out a land for themselves over a 13-year campaign. So the fundamental premise of the game is boatloads of Scandinavians coming into England, trying to make a home for themselves, and slapping around any Saxons that mention they were there first. Now, with our historical overplot established, we can see that the world map is pretty true to life as well. The game is split between the kingdoms of Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. And as is often the case, this map is really solid because, while some distances are squashed and stretched for geometric convenience, all the stuff is in the right place, and the main 3 cities in the game reflect the history. London, at the time, was abandoned, so it's presented as an old and beat-up Roman ruin that hasn't been cleaned in 5 centuries, and that's really cool to see. Meanwhile, the real heart of Wessex was Winchester. Compare this to York, or Jorvik, which was further north into Viking territory and had a huge Scandinavian influence, although in 873 it probably wasn't as far along as the game implies. Outside the cities, though, things get a bit weird, because Valhalla's England is full of castles that are half a millennium ahead of schedule. These kinds of choices are usually done for the sake of gameplay, and my most charitable interpretation is that Ubisoft wanted fort-busting adventure one way or another, so they reached into the latter medieval period to disguise the anachronism. On one level, I get it, but this is just the first in a long line of aesthetic choices that undermine the game's credibility. Another example of this is the bizarre inclusion of stave churches, which are certainly an iconic piece of Scandinavian history, but nowhere near this early, and especially when the Vikings weren't even Christian yet. And while we're at it, why is there a Christian church in Asgard? I mean, look, you know how this stuff happens. Someone put it in because it looks pretty, but guys, come on, if you wanted to have all this post-800 stuff, you could have. Just set the game 2 centuries later and it's fine. But by pulling in so many blatant anachronisms for the sake of style points, it really diminishes this game's ability to serve as an effective digital museum of history. And what's most frustrating is that the AC games already had a way to deal with anachronisms like this. When they wanted to include a really important landmark that came later, they'd show it under construction. And that's a clever nuance that lets developers add in cool stuff like, say, a partially domed St. Peter's Basilica in Rome without just lying to the player. That weird relationship with aesthetics goes beyond architecture because there are a lot of layers to Scandinavian history and the history of medieval Britain, and this game represents some of them in really iffy ways. So we see larger-than-life Roman-era ruins in London and across the country, and the land is populated by Celtic people, Saxons, and Scandinavians. And it really is great seeing the diversity to how many people have called Britain home by the 9th century. But, some of these representations are pretty bad. Like, real bad. Let's start with the Vikings, who are stylized to hell and back. The game is obsessed with the visual of dual-wielding weapons and axes flying like confetti, but neither of those are grounded in Viking history or sensible combat technique. 2 axes wailing gets you 2 axes failing, so it's silly to pretend like this is some special Viking battle tactic. It's not baseless, and later medieval history has examples of good weapon pairings like rapier and dagger, but a shield is almost always better than a second weapon. Meanwhile, the 2-handed Dane axe in this game is about 2 centuries ahead of schedule, and the giant flail is just wrong. The one point of contrast here is the presence of a female Viking Eivor, because we have written and archaeological records of Scandinavian women kicking some serious ass. So while not quite par for the course, not all that out of place either. Though there are more ways to be included than just waylaying adversaries, so what most strikes me as meaningful is how the character of Randvi manages all of the Raven clan's diplomacy. That's really cool to see. But in any case, the obsession with the sensationalized Viking aesthetic carries into the character design too, as everybody's wearing 2 metric cows worth of stacked leather armor when regular old tunics and chainmail would have been the standard. And then there are the tattoos. Now, Scandinavian tattoo art is sort of described in an Arabic source from Eastern Europe, but because it looks cool, everybody who's ever set foot in a longship is drenched in ink. It doesn't even bother me that Eivor's smoky eye could make raccoons jealous, it's just so frustrating to see Vikings designed in such a sensationalized way. Normally, this would just be a disappointing case of historical inaccuracy, but in this instance, it's extra dangerous, because Valhalla's Vikings share an uncomfortable amount of stylistic overlap with modern racist hate groups. Yay! So anyway, then there are also the Celts, who got done so dirty. It's just all the stereotypes smushed up into one. We've got people living out in the woods doing spooky pagan shenanigans while wearing animal skulls and 3 sets of antlers each. And really, that's just the tip of the bad history iceberg here, because a staggering majority of religion shown in-game is wildly sensationalized into spooky, scary, paint-covered shamans who send you on magical visions with the power of dank shrooms. Anyway, one of the post-launch expansions will take the player to Ireland, theoretically to go beyond England and get a fuller picture of the Isles, but oh boy, directly equating Celtic to
darker tones that really add to a mysterious feeling of the expansion
is a real red flag. Lazy at best, but really just plain wrong. I mean, heck, by this point the Irish were already Catholic. On the other end of the DLC, we'll get the 886 Siege of Paris, which is genuinely quite rad, because I'm really looking forward to getting outside of the Britain bubble Vikings are so often smushed into. So, back to our pals the Vikings. One of this game's strengths, or stumbling points, or maybe a bit of both, is the treatment of Viking activity. Scandinavians, in history, were a multi-talented bunch. Shipbuilding, sailing, trading, raiding, fighting, and settling. And that last one often gets brushed over, so it's great to see Valhalla spending so much time and care on the settlement of Ravensthorpe. Scandinavians came to England for a lot of reasons, but the end goal was often to simply make a new home, so all that raiding wasn't for nothing. Though that is where this game gets iffy. As is understandable for an action video game, raiding takes center stage, but the scale and content of what's happening here is really misleading. Our longboat boys preferred to target places like monasteries because they were rich in treasure and barely defended, but AC Valhalla also has us sailing D-Day style under enemy arrow fire to besiege an entire fortress, which is preposterous. Siege tactics are complicated, risky, and super not worth the effort when a band of Vikings could just keep on sailing and sack the next undefended town. And that's the thing. Vikings weren't fearsome because they could take down anything in front of them with the power of plot armor and copious axes, but because they could appear in an instant, basically anywhere, striking only at the weakest points, and only taking battles they knew they had already won. Cause let me let you in a little secret, when Vikings found themselves in a fair fight, they lost. So when Ubisoft developers describe the raiding gameplay as the core fantasy of Valhalla, it conflates these fabulous set-piece battles with the pillaging of innocent towns and monasteries, which was so immensely terrifying to 3 centuries of Europeans. Although this is very obviously done for the sake of fun gameplay, it's harder to stomach in this particular game because the protagonist Eivor is a Viking in addition to being an assassin. So the line between what's Viking stuff, i.e. real history, and what's assassin stuff, i.e. for gameplay, is almost impossible for the player to draw, and results in a warped picture of what the Vikings were really up to in 9th century England. Now, to be fair, Ubisoft have said outright that the narrative structure of Valhalla is meant to resemble an Icelandic saga, so the game uses the history to tell a larger-than-life tale in a way that is legitimately grounded in Scandinavian culture. That is really cool, but the sagas are many centuries off, and Iceland is not England. Which leads me to another bit of weirdness with this game's world, because lots of disparate elements from English and Scandinavian history across a wide stretch of time are smushed together into this one setting. The strength of this game is showing the interactions of an England in flux between Brittonic, Saxon, and Scandinavian, but it uses a lot of really weird multi-century anachronisms for representing each piece in order to achieve peak aesthetic. So whereas the Assassin's Creed series is best known for portraying distinct historical moments in time and space, Valhalla shows a composite picture of everything the Vikings have ever done and everything that has ever happened in medieval Britain. That's a huge change in the way this series treats its source material, and that's reflected in how Ubisoft have called this a Viking fantasy, because that's really what this is. This game is not at at all an accurate history, it's a grounded fantasy. I recognize that opinion is immensely more generous than what other specialists in English and Scandinavian history would grant. But also, many people with expert knowledge of the period will recognize details like how all of the Futhark runes in the game are accurate, some of the weapons are replicas of actual museum pieces, and the steering and construction of the longships is perfect. There is legitimately so much cool stuff packed into this game, but that almost makes me feel ickier about it, because the amount of A+ world design will make players trust the game and buy into the things that are complete and utter faff. And players who come in expecting everything to be wrong will miss out on some really amazing details. So this game is a hell of a mixed bag, where every brilliant and inspired piece of prime 873 AD realism is met by an equal and opposite piece of sensationalized nonsense in service to a fantasy. And at the risk of going into a sea of nitpicking, that's going to have to be where I leave it. So my verdict is, play it if you want to romp in a historically inspired setting, but trying to puzzle out what's real history and what's ass-blown nonsense is genuinely exhausting, so please just read a book about Viking England in between your play sessions. Thank you so much for watching. I didn't have a spot to discuss this in the main video, but this game's version of Jotunheim pulls the trope of blue frost giants as popularized by Marvel Comics in the 1980s, with no basis in any of the original mythology. Obviously not game-breaking, but another example of going all in on the hashtag aesthetic. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one, where, to put it in Viking terms, we're going back to Miklagard.